Yeah, so you clicked on that's it.
Okay, so from now on, no swearing.
Fuck.
Shame on you. Now the kids can't watch it.
Oh shit.
Yeah, you know how kids love talking geopolitics and markets. Well, maybe not all of them. So,
Hey, 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 hit the pause button. Hit the pause button for a sec.
pause Zoom record. So we just had a brief gap because I don't want to edit this at all. I'm too lazy. Where we discussed my son's problems at his elementary school here in Andover and the authorities' displeasure with some of his activities. Um, my son is showing early signs of similarities to the current president in some of his leisure activities, not golf. So anyway, so we won't worry too much about that. But yeah, so Corvin, tell me, what are you interested in? And
What happened today? I think that's wonderful way to finish the month, to be honest.
okay, well, yesterday I went on Maggie Lake's show and talked about how I was puzzled at the market's uh, relaxation and confidence that we would reach some kind of deal because it seemed difficult to get there. And of course, because I'm an absolute imbecile, the market rallies, what is it, 5% today or 3% or something? Uh,
Well,
partly,
absolutely, right from the close yesterday at 6, 20. Wow, yeah, 5%, nearly, roughly.
right. Now, uh, I could give you some kind of stupid platitude, like, bear market rallies are quite sharp.
That cat bounce and all that.
Well, this cat seems to be alive, but yeah, that's right. But I think some part of it, so there's some element of that, some element of Trump. There are two impetuses for this rally, one of which was Trump's comment that they can um,
Kiss
uh,
his ass and take the Strait of Hormuz themselves. He's going home.
yeah, he's done what he needed to do.
I mean, that tweet was phenomenal, right?
And
The Brits can more or less send their own ships down there. We're done and dusted. It sounds like somebody went and had a fight, got fed up, and just is going home. Then
you,
the question is the Venezuela thing pre-planned. I mean, I'm not sure that. I mean, the Americans can actually process Venezuelan heavy sulfur, right?
of course, because they built refineries specifically to take that oil. So yeah, in South
Now they can
Texas,
process it and resell it back to the Europeans. I mean, ultimately, the way it looks is stuff Europe and sell it back to them. Grab them by their
so
balls.
if you look at the actual numbers, there's not enough Venezuelan crude to do that. We're talking about
Yes.
really large quantities of Gulf crude is absent. Um,
Yes.
and of course, it's in the wrong place in an ideal world. But yeah, at the margin, I think I was on a conference call where someone explained to me that Chevron was currently Venezuela is producing 1.3 million barrels a day, and it might well go up to 1.5 within the year. And Chevron, maybe that was Chevron on its own, and they were very optimistic about ramping up Venezuela. And this was that Venezuelan real estate investment I did because I'm a complete imbecile. Um, but it worked out well. It worked out well because I bought in very cheaply like 2 or 3 years ago, and I was optimistic that something would change in that regime. Um, and I ended up the fund seems to have bought some prime Venezuelan, the Caracas real estate for prices that is roughly consistent with a McMansion in the area I live.
No, no, I mean, as far as I understand, Caracas is definitely the Dubai of South America at the moment, and it's been for years, right? I mean, there's streets there where you have Ferraris, Porsches, Lamborghinis, Rolls Royces, right? I mean,
Relatively small areas of the town,
but
to
you
be
still get that,
fair.
right? It's all kind of oil
There's
funded,
a
right?
bit, yeah, a bit. There's a lot more money in Sao Paulo, but then Sao Paulo is,
Oh,
the size of
specifically thinking about
Venezuela, right?
from the people who come from there, right? Like whatever gossip I get from down there. So it's
Yeah, well, you will get you're in a great location to hear all sorts of gossip about crass Venezuelans in Panama. And they don't really, a lot of them don't really live in Venezuela. They live in Florida and they spend
Miami.
time in Venezuela, in Caracas or Margarita Island. So anyway, that worked. And, I thought they did quite a good job that the Trump administration did almost the smallest change that you could do and yet fully reintegrate it into the American sphere of influence. So cute, right? Really cute. I feel a bit sorry from Nicolas Maduro, but I think that it's a mistake dancing when Trump is
What
threatened.
was what were those pictures about his wife? Was he beating her in prison, or like who? One of them came out with a blue eye, and
I didn't see that, but it wouldn't, prison's a bad place to be an ex-dictator. So who got beaten in the
I can't remember if it was her or if it was him, but one of them obviously took out the entire situation on the other. You can imagine
I'm not
the
100%
marital feud
sure.
when Trump jumps in.
Are they really being held in the same detention facility?
I don't know. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I mean, it's always possible that Nicolas Maduro is trying to set up his own kind of little power structure in the prison, and other people took that badly. I don't know. Maybe his wife didn't like the food. I
But
didn't. I'm not a big fan of
going back to the
Venezuelan food.
markets and something that you mentioned like a couple of days ago,
Hmm.
it's interesting that not only are the equity markets going up as well, but gold is going up as well, right?
So I took that. I've assumed a lot of that is because so there's a bigger problem when you destroy huge amounts of accumulated capital in the Gulf area, that Gulfies will have to sell assets to finance either their purchases of Patriot missiles or to finance their ongoing budget requirements because they can't sell oil, or simply to rebuild and reconstruct the big holes that have been blown in their hotels and other buildings, not to mention refineries and gasification plants and so forth. So I'd assumed that we were seeing gold selling um, uh, simply to maintain certain pegs in the area, and the more stuff gets destroyed. After all, that's what gold is for, right? It's a
Yeah.
store of value that you're going to liquidate when you need money. And
And
boy,
it
do
kind of
they
makes
need money.
sense now that with this announcement by Trump, both equities and gold would go up on this kind of relief, right?
That's my working hypothesis. I'm wrong a lot, Corvin, as you're aware, but that would seem. And the better question is, we have two sets of statements, one from Trump and one from the Iranian president. I'm tempted to say Pezeshkian, but I'm mangling it. Pez. Oh, I can't even find it. Can we Iran's president or whatever?
Yeah.
Some
Ah, Bezeshkian.
Pezeshkian. I can't pronounce it right. There we go. Pezeshkian. Yeah. So Pezeshkian said they're open to a peace deal, and that further fueled the rally. But I don't see any change in anyone's position. I think Trump's position is far more interesting than Pezeshkian's. Iran's always been open to a peace deal, provided we meet its demands. And that's true for my wife. She's open to a peace deal, provided I meet her demands. My son, he's open to a peace deal, provided I meet his demands too. Everyone's open to a peace deal, provided you meet their demands.
That's kind of the definition of peace, right?
Well, sometimes we have to compromise. But if you've seen Iran's demands, you might be less confident that we're going to get to a peace deal.
Sure.
So one of those demands is that the United States pays reparations.
Yes.
That's not as hard to imagine. Um, you can imagine them giving them $100 billion, which is Iranian money that's been frozen. And so it's not so hard to imagine that being included in some reparations total. But they asked for 500 billion. Maybe it's a negotiating position. 500 billion over 10 years to
But wasn't
rebuild.
there also, yeah, no, but wasn't there also, in addition to the damages, also interest payments on assets frozen, right? I mean, they're kind of trying to
We one
backdate
would
a whole bunch of payments.
I imagine one would negotiate around over those details at some point. So um, the the bigger sticking points are that they want the United States to leave all of its bases in the region. Well, they've hit
Yeah.
them all with missiles, so they're not in the best shape at the moment. Um, I think they want to extract a tolling system on flows of oil from the Gulf.
Mhm.
I don't think the United States is, judging by Trump's tweet
We
pointing
look
out
to do
that
with
they
this.
don't get their oil from there, like, we don't care. I don't think they'd buy. And you know what I've been fascinated by is I'm seeing um, uh, speeches by the Israelis talking about the need to build a pipeline to diversify the oil routes overland through Israel, and that would terminate in Israel. And what can I say? My spider sense is tingling as I look at that because a whole series of events make an awful lot more sense in the light of that. The Iraqi invasion now makes much more sense. The collapse of the Syrian government, of course, Assad was a brutal and disgusting dictator, much like many other brutal and disgusting dictators, but Assad's gone. We prioritize removing him. We don't, the other brutal, disgusting dictators we haven't prioritized removing. There's a reason for that. So it's now possible to build those pipelines, and it's now possible for oil to be rerouted from the Straits through to Israel. And that would make it possible also to extract, well, you can always extract gas, but you want that gas to go to Europe. And that would replace the Russian gas that's no longer going to Europe. So everything fits together nicely. There's a load of gas off the coast of Israel, Lebanon, and Gaza. And if you built a pipeline running to Israel and then build that and then run that pipeline underground along the seabed, you could supply Europe directly without having to use all those tankers. So the whole thing, sometimes things are accidents and you get lucky, but I wondered whether people had this in mind, going back a bit and thought about how this would be better. And truth be told, it probably is better, isn't it? Don't know. Certainly, if you don't want to give revenues. One of the problems with Russian gas is that Russian gas, some of it comes from Russian territory, but quite a lot of it doesn't. It comes from ex-Soviet states, like, for example, Turkmenistan, which happen to be sitting on a whole huge amount of gas that, because there's no other pipeline, the Russians buy very cheaply and then send that gas over to Europe at a big markup. Still cheap compared to liquefied natural gas, but they added a markup and there was nothing, we couldn't access that gas directly because there's no pipeline. Well, I suspect that people had in mind that other pipelines crossing the Caucasus and going through the Black Sea, and if the Russians lose the war against Ukraine, I can imagine that pipeline being built as well.
I guess what's interesting about the scenario you were painting is somehow this must manifest, express itself in the markets, right? So, given this energy politics, the market kind of where's it really heading, right? Because oil hasn't
So
necessarily come off today.
yeah, so there's strategy and tactics, and there's long term and short term. And to be fair, there is a temporary shortage of oil that,
Yes.
you're not going to build any pipeline anywhere in the next, four
Yes.
contract delivery points. So we have a problem. Although, really, when I say we, I mean Asia has a problem. I have a problem because I use natural gas to heat my home. And I can see that getting more expensive, but not in the short term here, because there's only a limited amount of export capacity in the United States. We don't have enough gasification terminals, and but I can see how there's now going to be a shortage of natural gas globally for a while, and any amount that's exported from North America is going to be much more valuable when it leaves these shores. And that's why my Chenier stock is doing okay, and other North American hydrocarbon producers are doing good. So um, that's one side of this. And the question, so the thing that I really wanted to focus in on is Pezeshkian, his comments. There's not really a change there, and the market might
Mm.
be going a little crazy by focusing on that. But I think perhaps short covers are short covers, and it doesn't.
Yeah.
If the story is there, you don't get in the way of that. You're going to get run over. Sorry, I got in the way of it. I feel
To run
slightly
over.
slightly run over. Yeah. So but Trump's comments are much more interesting, and we exchanged texts on this. What's the phrase again? Something like you should take Trump seriously, but not literally.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah. That was kind of cryptic. So, and I think my question was in terms of I buy this idea that, Trump is our guy from New York and he's been wheeling and dealing and he knows how to do that, right? But I think my
oh,
reaction to that was, well, if the attitude is let's not take him by his word, then that can also be interpreted his word doesn't count for much, at which point you get into a situation where anything that's being communicated just raises the stakes. That within itself has impact upon people who determine policy into the future. And that means that as a partner, as an ally, the United States becomes very unreliable. And then that must have implications for how people view investment. Because ultimately, I agree, right? Like wheeling and dealing real estate, that's one thing. But trying to create stable outlook for policy for participants in macro and microeconomics, and that's a completely different ballpark, right? Like I don't want to wake up today and think, fuck, do I have to buy potatoes for the next 10 years or move to Wyoming with a shotgun and baked beans or like, the aliens are going to try to do an anal
no,
inspection. All that.
you might like Wyoming. I don't know why you're so negative, but
I'm not, I mean, just the concept of living in the middle of nowhere really turns me on.
uh, right. Well, you'll have a long drive to the nearest Costco if you do that. But okay. Um, so uh, the the observation I would make is I think that the comments I'm seeing from Netanyahu, they do mesh with the comments you're seeing from Trump. And this is a problem that Europeans have, and Europeans, you could view them as allies, you could view them as strategic competitors. My old colleague and mate Julian, he made the point you made very forcefully. He gets very passionate about these things. It's almost like he's got skin in the game or something. I don't get it because I want to trade as well as possible to make money, but I don't know which world power I support. I live here, so I'd like the US to do well, but you know, and but Julian got really upset as Trump was making these statements in calls I've had with him and stuff. And he said, "Look, you can't have a Pax Americana and also say you're on your fucking own. Yeah, tough shit, suckers. We're out of here. Call us if you need some gas." That's not a Pax Americana. That's a Pax Parthia, if you will. We're going to be asking the Iranians nicely if we can get gas. So you
Actually, that's the first thought that came to my head. Like, I mean, apparently the UK is now in its Cobra meetings because what the hell are they going to do? If I were Starmer, pick up the guy to like his supreme leaderness and say, "Hey, ship me some oil."
well, there's a problem here, isn't there? Which is that the UK is so Starmer is pretending not to be a belligerent, a co-belligerent with the United States, but the Cyprus air base the UK
Right, he's not gone as far
maintains.
as Mark Carney. I mean, Carney has just like what sent Trump to hell, literally, right? Like on several occasions. I
Well,
mean,
they
he's
have
embracing the
disagreements.
Chinese now.
They have
So
disagreements.
this is the kind of consequence of having this kind of vague, imprecise policy that you flip on a coin. You will turn your allies into adversaries.
Julian argues that that's inconsistent with a strong dollar. That ultimately the reason why we hold dollars is because there's a Pax Americana, and that if it all comes to the big kind of part of a whole package, and failing to maintain freedom of navigation will help to further erode the dollar. And it's funny. I was reading something which said that dollars in central bank FX reserves have dropped now to one of the lowest levels since the end of the Second World War. They're 40%. They've been steadily trending lower. Um, I find, I don't really take that argument very, like it's true, but it's true on a multi-decade view. Yeah, the Roman Empire, there may be a problem. It may be failing, but it could be a while before Constantinople falls. you know. I wouldn't I wouldn't worry too much. It could take a long time for this to happen.
Agreed.
And
We have to define the time frame, right? If we're talking about this weekend, then things are
there
going to change.
isn't, yeah, exactly. And there isn't any alternative to the dollar, and yeah, maybe people will diversify a little bit more and buy a little bit more gold at the margin. But what are you going to do? Transact in Swiss francs in Asia? No, there's a store of value, there's a transaction currency. You're going to need dollar balances. There isn't going to be an alternative. At the margin, we will erode away some of the seigniorage advantage the United States has because you might have to do some of these transactions in yuan. But it's then the yuan is not going to replace the dollar. They don't want it to. They don't want to open up
Yeah.
their capital account. So I don't take those arguments as seriously as Julian. But what I do think's interesting is let's think about this thing about the hypothesis that Trump will say, well, we declare victory. See you later, Iran. We've crippled you, and that's it. We're off. Um, okay, so you've stopped fighting, but did the Iranians stop fighting?
Well,
Um,
but that's the great thing, right? From their perspective, the US doesn't really care. I mean, furthermore, it's interesting to declare, both sides seem to want to declare victory. I mean, is there any actual neutral arbitrator that can measure who's truly been
it's a,
victorious,
yeah,
right?
it's
I
a
mean,
point.
this is
It's
just
a points
insane.
decision, isn't it? You're going to have a points decision. We need the referee to say who's a
It's like
neutral
watching a
arbiter in
Wimbledon
this.
final. Both players say, "I've won." It's just like, what? How?
But
Who?
but it's not though. It's the thing about war. The fact that the Americans sail away doesn't mean they've won. And in particular, what will imagine you go and you bomb the bejesus or Muhammad out of Tehran and the infrastructure, and you set it back 20 years in its development, which I think is one of the objectives of this, certainly in Tel Aviv. Okay, great. Are the straits opened? Doesn't look like it because that coast is still there. What if you took Karg Island? Are the straits opened? No, doesn't make a difference.
No, it is just like miles away, right?
And what it does do is it prevents Iran from exporting as much oil,
Yeah.
but the straits are not opened.
No.
So the UK's Cobra Committee is still meeting, still getting very nervous and wondering how anyone's going to run anything. Okay, what about Tel Aviv? Are missiles still hitting Tel Aviv?
Well, depends if Iran declared victory or not.
Why would they declare victory? I mean, the Americans went away, which is great. They're not getting bombed anymore, but they can, and the Israelis won't necessarily stop. They have to reach a separate
Yeah.
peace deal with the Israelis. What does that peace deal look like? So they can still swap, attacks on each
Yeah.
other. The Iranians can't stop the Israelis bombing them, and the Israelis can't stop the Iranians using missile attacks on the Israelis.
No.
So I don't think that solves that problem. Whose problem is that? Well, maybe it's everyone in Asia's problem, the UK's Cobra Committee's problem, because the straits are not opened. So then you can say to them, "Okay, off you go. Go and open it yourself. We're not doing it. We tried. You didn't want to join us. Ha ha. Now who's got a problem?" And that doesn't fill me full of. It doesn't make me so relaxed. Doesn't make me very bullish stocks, apart from say oil producers or natural gas companies,
Right, so but
particularly
here's an interesting
bullish.
question, specifically stocks, because you mentioned stocks. How many of these top companies in the S&P are actually oil related and oil export related? Like, I mean, why would Amazon, why would Walmart, why would Microsoft, why would Google, why would Meta really care about what the fuck is happening in the Strait of Hormuz?
A fine, fine point, Corvin. I think the answer is about 5, 6%. And I looked this up the other day. Sorry, I say I looked up. I asked an AI the answer.
It's the same as looking up, right?
Yes,
I
that's
looked
a
at the
modern.
screen. Something talked to me from the screen.
Of course, it could be completely wrong. So I did double check it with a couple of AIs, but that doesn't prove anything. They can all hallucinate. So, yeah, and it's small, but of course, the joy of this is if you push oil prices up enough, the proportion of the stock market that's oil will increase too.
Yeah.
So that will get bigger. In fact, one of the fun things about this, every time somebody says to you, "Oh, we don't need to worry about energy because it's only a small proportion of stocks," that's because energy prices are low. That's why. When you put energy prices high, it becomes a big proportion. So prosperity is where energy costs are low.
Yeah.
And the absence of prosperity is where energy costs are high. And the other thing that occurred to me is we got these valuations based on a AI-driven future, which involves very cheap electricity prices. And we go, what very cheap electricity prices? Where is that coming from? So we're in this kind of zone where things could just like reprice completely
Well, I guess
because
people are always speculating about new technologies from fusion to mini reactors in your garden to, I don't know, cold fusion to magic from the skies. Aren't people like now shooting big solar panels into the sky? I mean, like it's like energy is, I mean,
Corvin,
you got the sun, you just have to plug into the sun. Like this orb, this gigantic orb rises in the east every day, right?
Um, I think Pippa Malmgren was talking about redirecting solar energy as a source of electricity on the Earth. How far away is that, Corvin? You're a physicist. You tell
One
me.
astronomical unit. That's the great
Yeah.
thing about physics. You always reduce everything to one. You don't have to remember the details.
No, but come on. I mean, should I really be factoring? I don't think fusion is around the corner.
No, it is.
I think it's getting closer, but I would imagine it's getting closer a little bit like my weight going below 200 pounds.
But I do think that people need to get their fear off the nuclear reactor stuff and look at new technologies that are there. I mean, I think Europe's decision, France's and Germany's to switch a lot of these things off is completely
Oh,
nuts.
that's going to be reversed. It's just you can't reverse it publicly because the incumbent politicians will look as dumb as they are. But no, that's already in the process of reversing because look around. So yeah, dumb
The one
decisions.
thing talking about electricity, why? So here's why is electricity so cheap in Iran, right? I mean, how is it? Because like, why does it cost only $1,000 to produce a Bitcoin in Iran? Which interestingly, like if you
The
look,
South Pars gas field.
huh,
So the reason why Qatar bought Man City is also the South Pars gas field. Qatar, which is a tiny little promontory run by a Sunni monarch, um, has huge quantities of gas, natural gas, sitting offshore. So does Iran, but they have to share it among 90 million people. Um, that South Pars gas field drives 80% of Iran's electricity needs.
and for how
It's
long
kind
more?
of
Till they're
silly
gone.
because that's why they want nuclear. Oh, it could do it for a long time. There's a lot of gas and a lot of the marginal global demand for gas is being satisfied by the Qataris. The Iranians, really, if we see the thing that bothers me about everything that's going on is the destruction of investment. Instead of having a cooperative solution uh, to deterioration in our productive potential caused by certain challenges like climate variability, increased defense spending needs, we have a non-cooperative outcome. And our non-cooperative outcome is to turn places into deserts and destroy all the capital in them. Well, that's just going to make capital more expensive. And I'm sitting there looking at real yields on 30-year tips. Now, I'm an idiot. We've already established that to our absolute satisfaction. But rather than thinking too hard about my investments, I took like 300,000 bucks and bought long dated tips at about 2.5% real yields. And I thought, that's great. I mean, how bad can that be? If I wear this long enough, I'm not going to be perfectly indexed to inflation because you can't be. But at least I won't make the mistake of putting it into a taxable account. I'll put it into a retirement account and then I won't get paid tax on the inflation adjustment. And 2.5% compounded for 20 years, real plus inflation. Well, I'm going to bet that inflation's going to pan out. Is not that it's an inflationary environment, just that we're getting poorer. So we're going to have more inflation than we expect, and the average inflation rate will be surprise us and be higher in outcome than pricing, so maybe 5% or something like that. I know it's absurd, right? Really high, but what has the inflation rate been on average for the last 5 years?
Well, okay, yeah, yeah,
Okay, so I mean, it's all
kind of relative.
it's a whole series of special causes have resulted in inflation being higher than we expected. And you couldn't possibly have seen a pandemic. You couldn't possibly have seen a series of wars in the Middle East. But you kind of could. So,
Maybe not the pandemic, but maybe the aftermath of your policies, right? In terms of printing money and then the effect of having wars in the Middle East. I mean,
we're going to be spending 2 or 3% more of GDP on weapons. I don't know where that GDP comes from. There are two
so this
possibilities.
is Eisenhower's famous military industrial complex, right? Against which he warned.
I'm not sure it's that, but it's true that weapons are expensive and the people who make them have no incentive to make them cheaper. They should make them cheaper because remember the Stalin comment?
What?
Quantity has a quality all of its own, something along those lines. So if you make lots and lots of cheap crap, that can help in a war. The Iranians took that on board. That's why they've got an absolute crap
Yes.
ton of drones and missiles because they made lots and lots. Anyway, so that two to 3% of GDP in the developed world, industrialized world, I don't know where it comes from. And my suspicion is it's got to come out of our consumption. There's no alternative to that. So we're all going to be a little bit worse off over time. Standards of living will decline, not increase on average. And we're already experiencing that. And that's without actually, that's simply because of terms of trade going against us. When when we do actually spend that money on defense, right? Apart from the United States, nobody else is really spending. Maybe the Germans a little bit. You can kind of tell by Rheinmetall's stock price. When we start to spend those, 4 or 5% of GDP on defense, we'll notice. You'll notice it anyway. So
When you say notice it, you mean specifically in the stock market or
stocks for sure. So Rheinmetall's fun because I remember recommending it at 500, right? Um, and this
where's
is
it trading now?
I'm guessing like 1500 or maybe
Yes,
1800,
1500, yes.
something like that. So, and I bought it at 500 as well. I recommended it for people I was writing for at the time. And somebody wrote in a comment, "Oh, great, that was 200, and now you're recommending it at 500. Thanks." And I thought, that's a fair comment. It's a fair comment, but I can't help but think, the trend is your friend here. So,
Exactly, right? I was going to say,
right.
right? The age-old adage.
That's right. And it probably, and the problem with Rheinmetall isn't that we don't need more weapons. They make the wrong weapons. So they've got a deal to build all of the American stuff like HIMARS and Patriot on license from the American manufacturers, and they'll build it for Germany. But those aren't really the weapons that, if been watching the Ukraine war as much, and I've got to get better hobbies. That's a terrible hobby. I should do beekeeping or something, right? But what I learned from watching that war is it's all about drones, all about FPV drones, all about long range drones, drone versus drones, anti-drone drones, pro-drone drones, everything's drones. That's it. And you can't have concentrations of soldiers because of too much visibility. So that's why the Russian platoon size has dropped to like two guys sneak off and they hope to come back, but their job is to go and penetrate into no man's land or the gray zone, whatever, and see who shoots at them, and survive the FPV drones that are coming at them, and figure out if there's anybody left in that hasn't been hit by a giant bomb dropped by Russian aviation, the kind of JDAM type bombs. Um, that's how this works now. You can't put more than two guys together because if you do, they're going to get artilleried or missiled. You put 200 together to receive medals on a parade ground, and this kind of missile hits them because somebody sees them.
So that war in
So
Ukraine has been going on since 22, right? So that's what, 4 years.
And the Iranians have been paying attention, as have the bloody North Koreans. The North Koreans sent soldiers to go and fight with the Russians. And
Yes, yes, I remember.
I was just looking at a Ukrainian interview where the Ukrainian soldier said he'd had a North Korean prisoner who had bitten his own arteries in his wrist to kill
Oh, God,
himself.
like this.
And I'm like, are you
I can
sure that
barely watch
happened?
horror movies. I just don't even want to think about this. Jesus.
And I thought,
But
well,
talking about like if you have 4 years and you bomb the living shit out of something for 4 years, what the fuck is still standing?
so the
I mean,
area they're fighting,
once
the
when the
area
British
they're,
were finished with Dresden, like if you
yeah,
look at
yeah.
Dresden, there wasn't much standing after a couple of weeks of firebombing the place, right?
And
Like I
yet it
mean,
looks so nice
Dresden's
now.
just
They did
fucking
such a
ugly
good job.
today, right? Because
Yeah,
they
right.
rebuilt it after the war.
Yeah.
What's that? So is this really a war or is this like a Sudoku cross Sunday cross? What the fuck is it? Like I'm
Right.
an idiot. If
Right.
I bomb a country, I'm gonna bomb the country, right? What the fuck is going on there for 4 years?
Yeah, yeah. So this is a industrial zone, a little bit like the Ruhr, um, and it was hugely built up. It's just coal mine, steel plant, coking plant, and there's just and apartment buildings. It's just a hugely built up, and they turned it into a. They put a whole bunch of fortresses in 2014. From then on, they built like fortifications across the region. Something called the
So
Kramatorsk
are you
Banana.
saying that the Russians aren't really attacking the civilian population? They're just trying to destroy the infrastructure.
I'm surprised any civilian population lives there. It's true, the civilian population is proportionately more Russian, what's the word, sympathetic than that eastern part of the country. It was part of Russia proper. It was never part of things. It was who was it? Khrushchev? No, not Khrushchev. It's Lenin that transferred it into Ukraine in 22, I think. Could be wrong about any given date. So, but this is an area that's mixed. There's Ukrainians, there's Russians, there's Tatars, all sorts of people living there. Welsh people. The area of the Donbass was first developed by a guy called John Hughes. So there's a town named after him. Uh, Hughesville or something. Um, chubby face guy. I can imagine playing rugby. I've seen the picture of him. Anyway, so it's heavy going, tough to think. And what we've learned from this is you can't have masses of troops. They're just too easy to hit by with
No,
remote.
no, I agree. But what I'm asking is, this isn't World War II, and World War II only lasted five or
No,
six
no,
years, right?
it's more like World War One. Yes. There was a change in technology which changed the nature of war. People haven't really figured it out yet.
Right, but if the Russians are really so intent on grabbing Ukraine, why don't they just literally bomb the living daylights out of it and move in? I mean,
Well,
it worked for Germany, right?
right. So I think some part there's a trade itself. There's always a domestic political fight about international trade because
So I guess this
some,
is where I'm going with my question, right? This is not necessarily about territory. This is not about destroying an opponent. But there is some other interplay in the background, right? I mean,
yeah,
it does sound like they're completely
internal
intent on
Russian
eradication.
politics.
Yes.
Internal Russian politics. And there is a lobby in Russia that is saying, why haven't we nuked them? What's the point? We could use tactical nukes. That would solve this problem quickly. And then there's another lobby in Russia. So I would argue the following, and people will tell me I'm wrong. You will tell me I'm wrong, I'm sure. But here's my argument as to what's happening. If you're a Russian oligarch, what you'd like to do is go back to your chateau in the south of France. That's what you want. You want to
Yes.
get your foreign property back. You want to go back to sending your kids to British private schools
Yeah.
and
That's
to
because you
spending
can't
your
be just
time.
happy on caviar and borscht and vodka, right? Like there's so much borscht and vodka you
There,
can
there are
consume.
lots of good things in Russia, but you really prefer living in the south of France, and that's what you want. And you want to go back to that and go back to that international life. And that's sort of the lobby group, internal Russian lobby group that Putin represents. Putin was put in place by these people. People will argue with me about that and say he doesn't, but the oligarch, this has been a disaster for the oligarchs. They've not attended Cannes. Um, they've been unable to go to the Grand Prix and the horse races in the UK. It's just been terrible, and they're forced to pretend to being patriots. They're not patriots, right? Um, and then you have the national security crowd. And the national security crowd, I'd say that's kind of Lavrov's crowd. Lavrov seems to be in that. And those guys are arguing that if Ukraine is a part of NATO or is integrated, they will no longer be able to guarantee the security or severely impact the defensibility of the Russian Federation. Which is probably true because you place missiles there. You see the trouble they're having subduing it,
Yes.
right? And if you were to destroy it, the ability to reintegrate into European trade networks
Would be very
is
difficult.
gone. Is gone.
Yeah.
So the oligarch situation is kaput, right? The
Well, they'd have to
oligarchs.
then turn eastwards. They'd have to start eating sea
Yeah,
cucumbers.
that's right. And they have absolutely no intention of doing that. Besides, even for the national security crowd, that's not hugely attractive because they don't really want to become a Chinese province. You know,
Yes.
that's not really what they want. And so their
So what's
core,
interesting is we're now going back full circle to what you mentioned previously before that there's another way of getting to some common compromise. We were talking about wives, compromise, and peace, right? In terms of why don't people just come together to the table to negotiate this ultimately, right? And so what's preventing that? Because that's an interesting question. I mean, war and the Ukraine for like 4 years.
what's preventing that with inside Russia or outside of Russia?
Well, I guess that's both, right? And similarly in other places where we have conflict at the
So
moment.
eventually
Why the desire for military conflict?
so I think I don't want to answer that question because it's too emotive and people will get upset with the answer that
Mm.
I've come to myself. I mean, I could be wrong as well. I don't know. Um, but I will say that there's a sizable lobby within Russia that will not accept Ukraine under any circumstances being a militarily hostile state because it damages Russia's, what's the phrase, strategic depth.
Okay.
Israel is a country with almost no strategic depth. They would like some strategic depth, and they're currently in the process of getting some
Yes.
in southern Lebanon. Right? They don't, it's no fun having your, northern areas, missiled
Yeah. Yeah.
constantly, and people don't want to live like that, understandably. So they'd like some strategic depth, and that is probably quite bad news for people who were living in southern Lebanon.
Yes.
And there's going to be a disagreement about that. Uh, anyway, so we're watching the old world disappear and the new world being formed. The problem I've got with all this, and remember, there's a de Tocqueville comment about this. De Tocqueville explained that a statesman is a guy who facilitates the inevitable. It makes it less painful to get there. Um, I find Putin to be distasteful, personally distasteful. And that's probably because I'm not a huge fan of oligarchs. And also, I used to read this like gossip page in Russia, and some of the things that were suggested about him were so unpleasant that, frankly, it makes Epstein look an attractive character. So, but Putin's caught in a trap. You don't mess with the Russian security state. The FSB is a significant lobby. The Russian army, I was going to say the Red Army, there's no Red Army anymore. The Russian army is a significant lobby. They were never going to accept it. If you want to survive every helicopter trip you take, you had better play nicely with your Kremlin friends. And
Or
when
don't fall out of a hotel window. I mean, the number of people who fall out of hotel windows is ludicrous. I mean,
no,
you'd assume they'd find another method of disposing of people rather than a hotel window, right?
you have to, the joy about for tossing people out of windows is you don't have to bring anything with you. I don't like, oh, I forgot my gun. So sorry. Anyway, so the problem with getting, I'm wrong, right? Today the market has rallied 5%. I'm obviously wrong, but my argument's still the same. My argument is the IRGC cannot, there's no common ground between Trump and
Yes.
the IRGC. They can't reach an agreement. In fact, I did come across someone who explained this really well. He kind of nailed it in the shortest possible words, and I'm trying to see if I can find that note.
But
Um,
coming back in terms of conflict resolution, right? Like what we're seeing here is the way you've described it, a lot of proponents of military force, right?
it's a what did
So then that
was
comes
it
back to the
Bismarck
counterpoint.
or von Clausewitz? Somebody said something about um, military action being I can't, my
Uh,
browser isn't working.
War is not merely an act of policy, but a true political instrument, a continuation of political intercourse carried on with other means.
Exactly, exactly. And so that's part of the problem is what is the thing. What I was really looking for was a beautiful expression of why it's hard to come to a deal between Trump, and I bookmarked it. And now for some, I think Twitter might be down. I blame the Iranians. Yep, oops, something went wrong. So I cannot get into my Twitter. But the bottom line is the intersection of the IRGC's interests and the United States interests is an empty set.
Yes.
And there's just no easy deal to be reached. Now, here's the thing. We don't generally go head first into World War III. Most the sensible people want to avoid being, turned into a gas. Um, so, um, so one would think there'll be some that that tension will be managed. But the problem I've got is I cannot see how a ceasefire is in Iran's interests. It's now or never, right? The IRGC is the last stand. It's the Alamo for the IRGC. There, there really isn't any alternative to reaching a final settlement and a full peace deal. And that's how you should read that Pezeshkian statement that they're open to a peace deal,
But
but
the demands
they're
are
not
not meetable.
open. They're not open to a ceasefire. And that's the problem. So,
But then that would also mean for the RGC, it's an existential question, right? Because should they start to compromise and enter into a peace deal, I think at home they would also lose a lot of standing and power, right? And then it starts to
well,
get bigger.
I'm absolutely sure they're currently looking at cracking down on any domestic dissent because that's the next thing that will happen. Um, so I have no doubt in my mind whatsoever that this is a really bad time to surf the internet in Tehran. When they reopen it, they will be checking, like Santa Claus, checking what you're doing, whether you're naughty or nice, quite hard. Um, so that, one observation. Um, that doesn't mean, we talked about Trump being serious. That doesn't mean that um, we shouldn't think about this idea that the United States is prepared to sail away. So Straits of Hormuz remains closed. You bomb them, you walk away. Um, why do the United States care? Well, who suffers from this? China a bit, right? They need the oil. They've stocked up. They saw this coming. They could see the military buildup happening, so they obviously anticipated what was going to come. They they can last maybe 2 or 3 months with their SPR, and then they've got a problem. The damage to the Chinese economy will be relatively small compared to the damage to, say, Japan's economy. Japan shut down a bunch of nuclear reactors. It's very dependent on imported hydrocarbons. India, Pakistan, very dependent, no significant inventories, no SPR, very dependent on imported hydrocarbons. Australia, pretty dependent on imported hydrocarbons. And then you pointed out the Cobra committee was meeting in the UK. Well, I suppose everyone's Cobra committee is meeting because civilized life stops if you don't have enough hydrocarbons. So there's a problem, and we do need the world needs to reach a peace deal. If Trump just walks away having broken it, and there was a beautiful thing where Lagarde was correcting Scott Bessent. There's a G7 meeting, and Scott Bessent said something about, we should, we don't need to have a peace deal, and the Straits of Hormuz will calm down soon enough. And Christine Lagarde said something along the lines of, there's enough damage to infrastructure that we do have a problem already. There isn't going to be sufficient natural gas globally. One of these kids playing this game of musical chairs is not going to get a chair. So there's no real way around that. Demand destruction is not as benign as it might sound. That phrase is not entirely benign. So I don't know. There's going to be some kind of peace deal eventually, but what I struggle with is this notion that the United States is going to give the Iranians $500 billion. And this peace deal, if what we can bomb them and then it
No,
will
but the
sail
peace
away.
deal is not meetable, right? Like under no, so I mean, for all the goodwill, should the United States enter into this peace deal and try to meet all the demands, then you look like the schmuck, the bully in the playground
Which
who's being told off by the teacher for having bullied, and that's not exactly the propaganda they want or need. So and I think the Iranians are fully aware of the fact that this peace deal is not meetable, right? And so it's more like, hey, we're playing the game, we're moving our lips, but there's no real intent on finishing this off in any sort of peaceful way. So the question then is, how long can it last? How long will it last? And I think for the markets, what will that mean, right? I mean, this is actually the interesting question. Like, if I were to position myself now, right? Like, I've always been a big believer that the equity market went up 120,000, 60,000% in the last 120 years. This is more or less a blip. I mean, even COVID, which was kind of a global disaster, people have forgotten about it, right? So I think in 6 to 12 months' time, we'll either have forgotten about this or we're in a cave in Wyoming. So either way, the only thing to do right now is to buy equities, as far as I'm concerned, right? But
I
that's the long
bisect
term.
I bisect that. I'd say that so first of all, if you're in North America, the damage to energy will be more expensive because it's a global market, but it won't be in such short supply, right? We're not going to have to switch off a whole bunch of plastics factories
Yeah.
um, in North America. That's probably not so true of Asia. I think there's going to be an enormous global lobby pushing for some kind of deal, and that Iran will be isolated. But really, hasn't Iran been isolated for 30, 40
Yeah.
years? No. So I think they want to reach a universal settlement here with guarantees. That's why they say that, so that it's expensive for the United States to retrade it, which has happened multiple times already. Um, and that may, you saying that there'll be a loss of face, there will be a loss of face. And the question is, how does the Trump administration manage that? And, I don't
As
think
long
it's
as it happens after
impossible.
November, who cares, right?
I just don't think it's impossible to find some compromise which minimizes the Trump administration's loss of face and gives the Iranians what they want. I just find it hard to imagine how you get the Israelis to a place that they're okay with.
Yeah, because we haven't mentioned their their part of the playground yet, right? Like, I mean,
Right.
their engagement in the war, right? And what happened February 28th, was their engagement purely from a strategic security perspective, or like because you brought energy politics into this, right? The construction of potential pipeline, etc., right?
Mhm.
And then, of course, Trump's statements about turning Gaza into a Gulf resort comes to mind, right?
You say that like it's a bad thing. I don't, what are you
I'm not.
against
I'm just
progress?
labeling it. I'm not saying good or bad. I'm just saying
Okay,
like obviously
okay.
the cards are already on the table, right? So,
Mhm.
big picture, what is it that everybody's getting out of this? I mean, you don't just send human lives to shit because you don't. What is that? What is it that people are hoping to get out of this?
Oh, I don't know, Corbin. Sometimes people can cooperate to achieve a real complete disaster. First World War wasn't a good idea, and neither was the Second World War. So it's not impossible that we can, that people might have thought they could get something that they can't get. That there could be misjudgments here. Um, I think there's a bunch of people who wanted to remake the Middle East. They wanted to remake it in such a way that Iran was less of a threat. And that would include every monarchy in the region. It would include Israel and it would include the United States. And I really don't think the Chinese were that bothered about it per se. That it's not, I don't think they're there thinking to themselves that Iran's sovereignty is a core Chinese interest. I don't think so. Iran's oil is a core Chinese interest, but not its sovereignty. However, if you remake this in the way that some of these speeches from Netanyahu have suggested. China has a problem. China does have a problem because some of that oil would be directed to Europe, and then it
Mhm.
costs more to move it. And
Mhm.
also, it's possible, like the Iranians can shut the straits, but anyone on that coast can shut the straits as well. That would include the Gulf. If the Gulf had an interest, or Gulf was allied with the Americans and they wanted to shut the straits, the Chinese shit out of luck. So, you know, the problem here is that other people could get drawn in. But yeah, I find it really hard to imagine a simple, clean exit for the United States here. That's the problem I got. I can be wrong. I can be wrong.
So here's an interesting question. I remember when in 2003 you had the second Iraq War, right? Like, it was interesting because you just went out of this internet burst. You had the lows in March of 2002. It was a disaster. Money was lost. But then with war on the horizon in March 2023, and of course the S&P going above its 200-day moving average in September of 2002, like the thing that took off most was the entire defense sector, Boeing, Thales in France, et cetera, et cetera, et
Mm,
cetera. Right?
mm.
Could you, in some sort of perverse way, argue not that it was the intent, but one of the consequences is that you will have a re-stimulation of the equity markets to go to the upside with all this war going on down there?
So this war has been a catastrophe for fiscal policy. It's moved us off the top. We've shoved US debt levels up a little bit more. Um, that's stimulative. It's stimulative in the same way that Keynes's arguments about digging holes and filling them back up are stimulative.
Yes.
Um, I suspect we're in an era in which defense spending is going to be secularly higher, and that you are meant to own defense companies. The way the defense industries are structured in the US, it's not ideal. They're basically monoliths that extract rents from the government budget. They build the wrong weapons. And what will happen is that
Actually, are these
startups.
companies ESG compliant? No, just wondering, right?
Yeah, I imagine they are, Corvin. I imagine
Fuck
they are.
me.
Yeah. Um, So I just think that will get fixed because small startups will build the right weapons and they'll buy them. But yeah, like you make this point every time we talk about anything bearish on equities, which is that equities generally go up, right? And they're gonna go up even in bad times. And I think that's true. I think
So
that's true.
even more so, like if you look at emerging markets, right, over the last 3 months, I mean, they've just done phenomenally well, right? Like Brazil is up like 23% for the year.
Not in the last 1 month, right? So it was before that the EM did well, and some part of that was the dollar was soft for a bit, and the real was stronger. I have Brazil, I own it. It's one of the things I really like. I have Mexico, I own it. It had done better, given back a bit. These are all like I think this kind of now that we've established that South America is part of the United States sphere of influence, we don't have to fight about it, right? So, and that's a good thing. That means these economies will grow. They'll export resources to the United States. They'll make 8% return on equity, 8 to 12% return on equity. And there's not much that can get in the way of that. So yeah, I like them. I think they're cheaper markets. They'll work really well. I think a lot of people like EM, and EM there was a hiccup in this move. This move has hurt EM markets. They've underperformed the US, not outperformed it because the dollar rallied. And that can reverse. So yeah, I mean, we've already spent like these videos, these conversations shouldn't be too long. They're they're meant to be for people to take a look and understand it. And I felt obliged that, thank you for humoring me and talking about this because I went on Maggie Lake and I timed that to perfection to look like a complete horse's ass. Not for the first time either. Um, but I still can't see an overlapping set for the IRGC and the Trump administration. And yet we still need to find a way out. They will find a way out because we're not going to go straight to World War III. Also, sorry, to the hot phase of World War III, because we're obviously already in World War III. It's
Look,
just
worst case scenario, we have to wait 25 years for all these people to die and the next generation to take over power, right? But
sorry, in which country?
globally.
Okay. So, you know, actually, that's not so true of Iran. The next generation just took over. There was a catalyzing event. The Americans and
Yes.
Israelis helped transition us into the new generation of Iranian leaders, the ones whose Swiss bank accounts are a little bit smaller. So we'll see. We'll see how this new generation does. I don't know whether these people are. I can't tell who is the most extremist in their religious views. Everyone seems to. I mean, like,
I'm sure ultimately they're all pragmatic, right? I think pragmatism does win the day, one way or another. Because it goes back to the to what you described, like the Russian oligarchs, right? They still want to enjoy the good life.
oh
I
yeah,
think also,
absolutely, absolutely.
no, yes, you mentioned time, so it's been almost an hour and 10 minutes, but hey, I love talking to you, right? Because you've got this very global macro perspective that is not very easy to find, right? Nowadays, I think people are
It's
just
it's pretty easy to find, and I'm an idiot as well. But I like to think that I'm the kind of idiot that's dumb enough to say things that other people are too smart to say,
Well, then
and
let me
they
ask you
know
this.
full
Over the
well.
next
Yeah.
quarter, because now today, I guess the 31st, it's the official end of the quarter, and
Right,
people
which
are
is by the
rebalancing.
way, that is not an accident. This rally coming on the last day of the quarter,
Yes,
ah, come on. Don't ask me to believe
exactly.
that's an accident, but
No,
okay. Right.
so people are rebalancing, right? And so if we just have a very short-term outlook for the next quarter, the next 3 months, what assets do you think will outperform, if any at all?
So this whole thing has been a disaster for US bonds. And actually, I'm not going to answer your question. I'm going to ask a different question or make a
Okay,
point around your question.
go ahead.
You'll know a lot. Like we saw bond yields selling off in the teeth of a Trump administration policy to buy mortgage-backed securities that was being implemented by the GSEs. That was meant to be simulative. It was meant to hold fixed income vega and gamma down, volatility down, and keep yields down. And instead, 10-year yields went up by 50 beeps, right? So problem, right? Not huge problem, but a problem. Um, I did this Substack post where I pointed out that in 2007, oil hit 104,
Oh yeah,
2008,
yeah,
oil hit 147. And then soon afterwards, we realized that there were other problems and
yeah.
oil collapsed. So I'm very interested in how bonds trade from here. Um, if we are worried about the Pax Americana collapsing and the geopolitics getting unstable, then US bond yields could keep drifting higher. They've rallied in the last couple
But
of
I
days
think
as
we
a
can go.
piece.
I mean, just from a very naive modeling perspective, if the term premium is driven by inflation expectations, and you've just said 5%, right?
In
Is
one
that
year in 2026, not necessarily for the next 30 years.
yes, but the way I understood it, at least the way I believe it, inflation averages are not going to be at 2% anytime soon, right?
I you know, I'm always a fan of a nice pithy short phrase, and it wasn't really me, but Olivier Blanchard. But he didn't say it this way. But 3% might be the new 2%. They're just not telling you.
And I personally think that's a bit way too optimistic.
Right. And it's you mean 4% is the new 2%.
Most likely, I think it's interesting, right? People tend to have very short-term outlooks. I don't think many people, at least I grew up to the 90s, right? Like I remember early 90s, if you wanted to get a mortgage, yeah, 15%, buddy, right? Like with all that influx back in Germany of a trillion Deutschmarks going into East Germany, right? Like it was absolutely nuts, right?
Yeah.
I think inflation, the way it exists now, is only a very recent phenomenon of the last 20 years, right? I think people need to dial the clock back and look exactly what happened. So I have the other one is if you believe in very long-term trends, I mean, you had bond markets going up in a straight line for 30, 40 years. Well, everything that goes up has to come down. Right? And it's very difficult to believe that interest rates from 4% will continue to go down to -4%, so we can continue having upward bond moves, right?
I think
So I
we
think
have.
maybe a situation like the 60s, where all you were doing on these bonds were clipping a coupon, which kind of prevented you from capital deterioration. That's what where you're going to be, right? I don't think bonds is going to be the next best investment place to have your money in.
So you can't steal money from bondholders forever. In the 70s, we took about 7.5% of US GDP from US bondholders. So there was unanticipated inflation that amounted to 7.5% of GDP. And that came out of bondholders, right? That was a cost to bondholders. We ripped them off. And what did that result in? Bond yields went to 12, 13, 14% because people don't like being ripped off and will defend themselves from it. And then they made back about 13% of GDP in the 80s as those bonds repriced because, they,
Yes.
and something like that will happen again because you can't consistently, you can't, you can fool some of the people all of the time, all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. So yeah, bond yields, we're actually answering that question again. I said 2 to 3% of GDP is going into defense. Other bits might go into other things like climate mitigation, and other issues like that, other national objectives. The Chinese are good enough to be, those nice communist people. They specify what their objectives are in their 5-year plans. You get to see them, read them. It's all very straightforward. I would assume we have the same objectives: fusion, quantum computing, robotics, AI, all the same objectives. If the Chinese want to do it, we want to do it. This is where the competition in the future is. So, my guess that the point you're making is that the resources to do that, they're going to have to come out of the hides of people holding fiat currency because there just isn't there. And these videos, we post them on a YouTube channel that I called Preservation of Capital because I think this is the problem. Like we have all these IOUs which say we are owed this future consumption, can't
Yeah.
possibly meet them. They're not good. They're not good. So some of this capital, it's some of the what you think is capital, it ain't capital. It's an IOU saying that you're owed this. Same as your social security, same as your entitlements, same as your corporate bonds, your government bonds. They are not going to give you the return you think they're going to give you because they can't. It's a
Yeah.
physical impossibility to meet all these objectives. And you've got to choose, can we pay these people their coupon returns or do we go for generative AI? Yeah, tough shit, Harry. You ain't getting your coupons.
Yeah.
So that's how it is. So I think you're making that point. And I'm curious about whether bonds blow out further from here, which will lead us to another place, and then there's going to be a solvency crisis in finance
Well, I
in
was going to
finance.
say, right, because if that does happen, then what happens to the credit rating for the United States?
Oh, I wouldn't worry about the United States' credit rating. They can always print more money. The United States isn't going to have a credit rating
But
problem.
what would printing more money then lead to?
Inflation.
Okay, right, and then you're in this kind of vicious circle because who then continues to have trust in the United States dollar? Why would you want to park value in a currency that's
We've
being
lived,
devalued to zero?
no, we lived through the 70s because everyone else has got the same problem, Corvin. Everyone else has got the same problem, including China, including Germany, including the UK. Some of them actually have it worse than the US. In fact, they all have it worse than the US, with the possible exception of China. So these problems are worse outside of the US. The US is pretty much energy independent. The US has a lower requirement for defense because it's isolated by two oceans, has huge advantages. And the US has a advantage of scale in technology, which means it's very hard for any, the French are smart people, the Germans are smart people. You've got all sorts of scientists. You can't do AI, you don't have the scale to do it, right? So you're going to have to piggyback off of American advances.
So then the argument you're making is 60,000% in 120 years. And it's
Right.
going to continue.
I'd be a dummy if I said, so there's short equities tactically, and they short equities strategically. Short equities or strategically is like chopping off your leg. It's just dumb. Don't do that. Don't do that. You have to transmit consumption into the future somehow. Equities have been a better way because it's a bet on it's the accumulated amount of industry. I note with interest, by the way, the indexes work in a peculiar way. So the losers get chopped out and the winners get kept. So bear in mind that the composition of your index may change. But yeah, American industry as a whole is going to have a positive return. That's right.
And so we
Uh,
end on that positive note.
right. Um, next time, can we talk about some of the things you're up to instead?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And let's do a video on that because I think people should be informed. And I think there's a huge amount of value in the stuff you're doing. Really, it's really interesting stuff. And there's much less value in
But I
talking
think
about.
that the big difference is what I'm doing is probably much more to the coal face about the mechanics and the dynamics of the market. You can then try to spin a story from that. What's fascinating, I guess, from your micro perspective is you're seeing the world as a puzzle, as a dynamical puzzle in which the different pieces interact and have cause and effect relationships, which then impact us as individuals in this bigger picture. So the conversation isn't just about which assets to allocate, but how will I experience this over the next coming years? Whereas if I talk to you about which sector I want to allocate, which equity factors are working, right, then with it's a different
Yeah,
kind of approach.
ex
It's
ex
interesting,
exact.
but yours is kind of more existential.
I think what you're doing is much more interesting and much more practical. I'm telling stories. I'm trying to help people make sense of things, which organizing facts in a certain way that tells a bigger story where you can kind of then extrapolate and predict the next step, right? And there's a value to that, but how much value, right? It
Well,
doesn't.
here's an interesting one, right? Because I guess macro traders always get accused of having nice stories, but they also need to get the timing right because it's always easy to just hop in at the wrong time, at the wrong point. So how do you deal with timing?
Corvin, let's do it. It's a great question. It's a really good question. And I use technical analysis, right? That's what I do. And that's why I sent you that technical analysis thing I got.
Yes. Oh,
But
yes. Yeah.
this video is overrun massively. Anyone who's still watching this has no life. I apologize. They should all be 40 minutes long and they should be little snippets. They should
But
not
not only
be.
did we finish on a positive note, I think the technical analysis hook is absolutely phenomenal. I guarantee you the next
I don't,
viewership
I, I
double in
don't,
size.
I don't have a better tool for dealing with this problem. And the question to ask is, why does it work? Why
Actually,
what
Druckenmiller recently came out, or I saw a statement by him that technical analysis now
it
has
doesn't work
wound
as
up.
well.
Yes,
Yeah, it doesn't
that's what
work as
they
well.
read.
That's right. But it still works a little. There's a sense in which it still works, and we'll talk about that. So
On
let's do
that note,
more. Always great, Corbin. Always great. Another time. See you later.